This video will be part 1 of Chapter 4, Learning for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In this chapter, you'll be learning about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, social learning theory, as well as biological and cognitive aspects that affect the process of learning. The study of learning is really kind of woven throughout all of psychology. As a school of thought, the study of learning goes back close to the very beginning of the science of psychology, and is the most akin to the logic, the assumptions of the other sciences like biology, chemistry, and physics, primarily because the early behaviorists who set out to kind of lay down theories and principles of learning really wanted to model their work after the work of other areas of science and to make psychology more sciencey. So that's kind of woven into the fabric of what we'll be talking about here. The principles of learning, basically how learning works, is what behavioral psychologists study. Cognitive psychologists have also been involved in especially more recent years, and by recent I mean the last 30 years. Cognitive science has revolutionized the way we think about learning. So the early behavioral psychologists kind of laid down the basics of theory. Then cognitive psychologists, psychologists who study motivation, have added to our more nuanced understanding of how learning works. So we're going to start with classical conditioning. Most of you have probably heard of Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs. You also may have been exposed to some urban legends about Pavlov's work and the work he did with dogs. Pavlov didn't start out as a behavioral psychologist, nor did he finish as one. He was studying the biology of the gastric system, of digestion, and he used as his subjects dogs, and by all reports he was fond of the dogs he used. There are urban legends out there about horrible abuse suffered by these animals, but the historical record really doesn't show evidence of that. So what did Pavlov do? Pavlov more or less accidentally learned about how classical conditioning works. He was studying digestion, and particularly he was studying salivary juices, how saliva is a part of that process, and he noticed that when he brought out the food for his animals, that even before the food arrived, the animals were sensitive to cues in their environment that predicted that food was coming. So the sound of doors, the sound of the filling of pans, things like that. Any of you who are pet owners know how this works. Like my dogs, if it is even remotely close to time for a meal, if I open the refrigerator door, they come running, and it's the sound of that refrigerator door that really clues them in that food is on the way. And one of them even starts to drool just like Pavlov's dogs. So what he noticed was that what the dogs were paying attention to were stimuli in the environment that basically predicted the arrival of something important, like food, when they were hungry. So Pavlov was the first to then, he shifted his attention to study this much more rigorously. He looked at these dogs, and he noticed, as I said, that the dogs showed what he called anticipatory salivation. So if they anticipated that food was coming, their bodies got ready and they started salivating. Now understand that salivation, whether you're a dog or a human, is not a voluntary response. You cannot say to yourself, okay, start drooling, and then have that happen. It's just not something that you can do. Or if I poke something close to your eye, you don't have a lot of conscious control over your blink reflex. So what we're talking about here in terms of responses, and this is why it's called respondent conditioning, we're talking about involuntary responses. So things that the body does naturally without voluntary control. And then what he was able to show is that organisms like dogs, and people for that matter, are very sensitive to predictive information. And if there are cues in the environment that say something is coming, then our bodies respond to those predictors. So he studied this intentionally in order to document the process. Now, you may have heard that Pavlov used bells. That's actually not quite true. He used a variety of stimuli to pair with the presentation of food, and it was, rapidly noticed that you could condition the dogs to pretty much any sort of visual stimulus or auditory stimulus that was predictably paired with the food. And the food, you don't need any kind of conditioning to create salivation to actual food. The body has to respond to that presence of that food visually and through the olfactory system by salivating. So classical conditioning begins with what's called a neutral stimulus. That's a stimulus that doesn't have the capacity yet to create a conditioned response. So it could be a sound, it could be a visual stimulus, it could be a smell, whatever. It has to be neutral at the start. So, for example, my youngest dog, my puppy, had no idea what crinkling plastic meant when she was a baby dog. But pretty quickly, she recognized, like all of my dogs have, that the sound of crinkling plastic was a very good predictor of the delivery of a treat, because a lot of the dog treats are stored in plastic bags that are very crinkly. So the neutral stimulus in that case would be crinkly plastic, which before conditioning has utterly no meaning to the dog. Then you have an unconditioned stimulus. There's a reflex. So if I have a very smelly dog treat, the dogs are going to respond to that with excitement as well as salivation in preparation for eating. So it's a stimulus that reflexively elicits an unconditioned response. Then you have an unconditioned response, and that's the reflexively delivered action. In this case, if you're talking about the wonderfully smelly dog treat, that's going to elicit the unconditioned response, unconditioned meaning untrained, of salivation. Then you have a conditioned stimulus, and that's where you persistently pair the sound of crinkling plastic with the unconditioned stimulus. So you would present the treat and the sound of the crinkling plastic. Treat, crinkling plastic. Treat, crinkling plastic. Pretty soon, the crinkling plastic alone can elicit the salivary response, and that's when it becomes a conditioned stimulus. So if I'm opening a package that has crinkly plastic, even though it doesn't have dog treats in it, it's likely to bring the dogs running and for them to start preparing to have a delicious treat. And that's how you get a conditioned response, in that the response is elicited by the stimulus that you've conditioned the organism to respond to. Now here's a completely different example. Every year when I go to the eye doctor, they do a glaucoma test, and in that test they have to deliver a puff of air directly to my eye. Now most of you have probably had this test at one point in time or another, and it becomes, after you've had the test once, it becomes very difficult to keep your eye open, and your optometrist probably has to be very crafty in delivering that puff of air. At one of my eye doctors, the machine that they used to deliver the air puff rather, had this odd kind of clicking noise, and right away it became difficult for the eye doctor to use the machine because as soon as you heard the clicking noise one time, it tended to elicit the eye blink response. So in this case, the clicking noise is the neutral stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is the puff of air, which creates the blink reflex. The unconditioned response is the blink reflex. The conditioned stimulus is the clicking noises that predicted the onset of the air puff. The conditioned response is blinking when the clicks happened. My eye doctor actually had to get a different machine that didn't send off those kinds of signals so that he had an easier time doing glaucoma tests. So let's review how classical conditioning works. Before conditioning occurs, you have an unconditioned stimulus, such as a puff of air or food, that elicits an unconditioned response. The neutral stimulus does not elicit that unconditioned response until it's connected meaningfully during conditioning trials. It has to be connected to that unconditioned stimulus temporally, meaning in time. So neutral stimulus starts just before the unconditioned stimulus. That automatically elicits the UCR. After conditioning, the conditioned stimulus will reliably, but not quite as strongly, elicit the conditioned response. Now, what do I mean by not quite as strongly? The unconditioned stimulus of food with Pavlov's dogs produces a strong salivary response. After conditioning, the conditioned stimulus will produce salivation, but not to the same level. So less saliva was produced. And that's actually something that Pavlov found. He also found that if over time you keep presenting the conditioned stimulus, but there's no delivery, like if you just played the sound or created the conditions for being fed, but no food was delivered, eventually that conditioned stimulus is going to lose the power to elicit the conditioned response over time. Now, in classical conditioning, there's also something called delayed conditioning, and here what you're doing is the timing. When you turn off the CS, you're going to delay turning off the CS until after the UCS is presented, so there's an overlap, and that means that the two stimuli, the unconditioned and the conditioned stimuli, are going to occur at the same time. So for example, if you're using a sound, like one of the sound stimuli that Pavlov used was a tuning fork. He would hit the tuning fork and the tone would be essentially playing while the meat powder was placed in the dog's mouth. And that creates the connection between the two. Now, in trace conditioning, there is a period of time in between. So you present the conditioned stimulus, it's turned off, then the UCS is presented. This is called trace conditioning because what you're assuming, and this was something that had to be tested, some early tests that Pavlov did, he wanted to know, does the conditioned stimulus have to overlap with the unconditioned stimulus in order for the effect to occur? And what he found was it really didn't. As long as there was a close enough time period between the two, then the signaling, basically the conditioned stimulus becomes a signal that even if it's delayed, even if there's a delay before the unconditioned stimulus is presented, there will be a memory of what that stimulus means for the organism. Now, fear conditioning, and again, this is another one of those situations where there's some serious urban legends hanging around in the universe about John Watson and Rosalie Rayner's research. Now, I will say, full disclosure, I think John Watson was a really crap human. He did a lot of unsavory things, but let's put that aside for a second. What Watson and Rayner did, and a lot of historians of psychology are like, wow, this is why ethics boards are really required. They used an infant who was someone known to the researchers, whose parent gave permission for the child to be used in this way. What Watson wanted to know was, could he classically condition a startle response, which he described as a fear response, using the same procedures that Pavlov did. So first you have a neutral stimulus, and in one version of the study they used a little white lab rat. What behavioral psychologist doesn't have access to rats? So the research assistant would present the rat to Albert, and at first Albert had no response to the rat other than curiosity. So the white rat was initially the neutral stimulus. Then you have Watson, as depicted in this sketch, behind Albert, and unexpectedly makes a very, very loud noise by whacking a metal rod with a hammer. Scares the bejesus out of the little boy. Again, ethics problem. That very loud noise, the unconditioned stimulus, is paired with the neutral stimulus, the rat being present. After pairing the conditioned stimulus, after pairing the rat with the unconditioned stimulus, eventually the white rat serves as a predictor that a loud, scary noise is going to happen. The conditioned response then becomes a startle reflex when the conditioned stimulus, the rat, is presented. Now, ethics aside, what this shows is that certain kinds of reflexive emotional responses can be classically conditioned. And in fact, many phobias have their origin in classical conditioning, where a person is faced with a situation that previously was neutral, but after a very scary kind of event, that stimulus takes on the power to be startling all by itself. So in treatment of people with phobias who want to reduce the impact of those phobias, they will do some reverse conditioning in order to become more comfortable with those stimuli. Now, fear conditioning in rats, so here we have the reverse. It's not the rat that is the conditioned stimulus here, the rat is the subject. And what this YouTube video is going to show is what rats normally do when they're in what's called a Skinner box. It's a training box. And full disclosure, these boxes tend to be wired with the ability to deliver very aversive stimuli. They also tend to have, a bunch of signaling events like lights or sounds that can be used to condition the rats. So what you're looking for in this video, there's no audio to it. You're going to see the rats moving around a bunch because that's what rats do in cages. They explore. They just look around, they look around, they look around, and then you'll notice that they freeze. That freeze response is a startle response in preparation for the delivery of something very unpleasant. So it could be, in some of these cages, it's designed to deliver a real powerful dose of white noise, or mild electric shocks to the feet. So this is before fear conditioning. You can see they're exploring, sniffing, standing up, doing all the things they usually do. Then the tone is turned on, and that's what's going to become the conditioned stimulus. Now, after they've been conditioned, so you'd pair that tone with the delivery of an aversive stimulus. Notice how they all freeze when the tone is on. That's the conditioned response. Now, the one little guy, he's trying to adjust, but that's how fear conditioning experiments are typically done. You pair a sound that previously had no meaning with the delivery of something unpleasant to the rat, and eventually the tone will become a predictor of bad outcomes. So it creates the freeze response, which when you're a rat and a predator is approaching you, you're going to freeze. Now, in the real world, if you're a rodent out in the wild, one of your big predators is maybe a fox or a coyote or even a hawk. In my neighborhood, we have very few squirrels anymore because we have a lot of resident hawks. Well, one thing squirrels will do, if they see the shadow, a bird-like shadow, like a hawk's shadow, they will freeze, absolutely freeze. They are less visible to that predator when they're not in motion. So they have that freeze response in order to hopefully camouflage themselves and avoid being eaten. Now, previously, that image of the shadow had no real meaning, but it was paired with frightening possibilities, like being swooped down on from the sky, and that elicits the freeze response. To review here, when we're conditioning fear or positive emotions, one researcher, Mary Cover-Jones, was able to show that when you had a person with a pre-existing fear of rabbits, in this case it was a toddler, a 3-year-old, she was able to decondition that fear. So she was showing that you can in fact use counter-conditioning or deconditioning to reduce the fear response when that fear response has been classically conditioned. So using that technique, you can basically undo. Elise Bregman, however, was unable to condition infants to fear certain kinds of inanimate objects like blocks, wooden blocks, and curtains, probably because there are certain kinds of organisms or physical objects that we're sort of biologically predisposed to have concerns about. So for humans, it's very common for us to have very strong reactions to things like snakes, spiders, and organisms with long teeth, dogs, cats, lions, tigers, and so on. We have a biological predisposition to fear certain kinds of animals. So being able to condition those responses is easier than trying to condition, say, fear of Legos. Although having stepped on them in the middle of the night as a parent, I have a great deal of dislike for Legos, but I would not say that I've been classically conditioned to fear them. I just remember my feet hurting. Now, in classical conditioning, you can change the degree of liking for a stimulus when it is paired with either a positive or a negative stimulus. So, for example, if you have a particular smell and it is routinely paired with something appetitive, like something that tastes good, that smell is going to have a positive association, a positive emotional association. If you pair a certain smell with something that tastes horrible or that makes you sick, then it becomes a negative stimulus all on its own, and this is referred to as evaluative conditioning. Classical conditioning in an applied setting can be used in advertising, although not to the degree that popular culture would suggest. In popular culture, classical conditioning paradigms, it's often assumed that they're incredibly powerful and you could basically brainwash people with them. That has never been demonstrated to be true. So that's basically science fiction. While classical conditioning can be used to increase the likelihood of you having positive associations, positive attitudes towards certain products. So for example, there's this commercial I use in my social psychology class. It was one of the Super Bowl ads for Doritos, and it shows a pregnant woman who's late in her pregnancy, having an ultrasound, and her rather insensitive husband is eating his Doritos while the ultrasound is going on, and apparently the power of the Dorito is it catches the attention of the fetus. The fetus decides to come early to get the chips and causes great pain as a result. And it was really a very funny ad. So what marketers are doing here is they're hoping to make you laugh often enough. So you see that ad enough times and it makes you giggle. You're likely, when you're in the store, to smile when you see the Doritos. And if you smile when you see a product, you're significantly more likely to buy it. Now, the learning processes that happen in classical conditioning, this image is a three-part graph. It shows the change in strength of a conditioned response during acquisition trials, which is when you're acquiring the connection between the CS and the UCS. During acquisition, extinction is when you stop the pairing and wait for the conditioned stimulus to lose power. And then what's called spontaneous recovery, which is you take a break and then you present the conditioned stimulus again and see if the conditioned response recovers. And it usually does, but not as strongly as before. So what are these three things? Acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. Acquisition is the process of acquiring a new response, so making the meaningful connection between CR and CS. Extinction is when the UCS no longer follows the CS. So you're the researcher. You take away the unconditioned stimulus. So if we're talking Pavlov's dogs, you just stop presenting food. You keep playing the tone, but you stop presenting the food. When that stimulus is played over time, the conditioned response is going to fade out and stop occurring. That's called extinction. Spontaneous recovery is after you take a break, you bring the dog back in, you play that tone again. There's going to be a rebound response where salivation starts to happen again, but it's not going to be as strong, and extinction will be faster afterwards. Stimulus generalization is also a part of the classical conditioning paradigm. We will also look at stimulus generalization when we talk about operant conditioning as well. Stimulus generalization means that in order to elicit a CR, what you can do is you can have many similar conditioned stimuli. Like the treat bags that my dog's treats come in, I mean, they're different brands or different types, so the crinkling plastic sounds a little different. It doesn't really matter to the dogs, any kind of crinkling bag, whether it's plastic or paper, whether it makes super loud crinkling or faint crinkling, it doesn't matter. It's crinkly noise, that's enough. So the more similar the stimulus is to the CS, the stronger the response will be. And the more kind of flexibility you bring in to your training, the more easily you'll be able to replace one conditioned stimulus with another. Now, in addition to stimulus generalization, you can also do stimulus discrimination. So what you have here, excuse me, in stimulus discrimination is you want the organism to learn that they only are to produce the CR when the CS, or a very, very narrow bandwidth of similar stimuli are presented. Now, this makes it sound like the dog is making choices. Not really. So if you're talking about the training situation that Pavlov used, you would have a tone, but let's say you were able to be very, very specific. You want, if you have, let's say you're looking at a keyboard, you want only a very narrow range of sounds in terms of pitch that the dog should learn are associated with food. So you present those, but you present other tones that are quite different out of the range of that pitch. And what you'll see is over time, and this takes a bit of time, over time, the dog will start to recognize that the tone that is meaningfully predictive is only in that really narrow range. The rest of the tones don't mean anything important and can be ignored. In discrimination training, and this can be done with any organism, your authors talk about a person. Basically, to start discrimination training, you present many different stimuli a lot of times. I mean, a lot of times. But only one time does the unconditioned stimulus follow, or rather, the unconditioned stimulus follows only one of those CSs. So like the keyboard idea that I was just describing, if you only want the 5 keys surrounding middle C to be your conditioned stimulus, you play sounds from all over the keyboard, but you only present the unconditioned stimulus with those five keys, and not with any of the others. Over time, that procedure will extinct the responding of the organism will go away. It'll extinguish unless it's within that narrow bandwidth of sounds. And that concludes part 1 of chapter 4.